Yes. I think it used to go back way, yes. So when the
I don't think we're back to 1960.
the amateur dramatics group had the 20th or the 21st show here a couple of years ago, and we took this out for them, and they did a play for a couple of nights. So
This should be old.
Trinity bought
They
it.
bought that.
Yeah, Trinity bought it. Probably about 11 years. I think it was on the market about a year when Trinity purchased it, but it's solely occupied.
And the guy sitting downstairs in security, that's where people used to go all the time. And also it was, and that's back door, another was for the prisoners.
I remember coming in just after we purchased it, before any work was done, and coming in the back door, the big timetable, the big turntable, and the trucks, that's all gone. And we have this big actually down there.
No, I had coffee down there about a year ago with my brother. My brother, he started in here he worked in the gas company, but eventually became the chairman and chief officer of the Old Gosh.
Oh.
And they made the headquarters down in Norway in Cork. They said that he had moved to Cork. He didn't, Snowy moved to Nace Road and operated from the pumping station. So he wasn't on that.
So was he being the chief executive in here? No.
Dublin Gas is separate from
Oh.
gas. Old Gas you can pay for that.
No, it's just
No,
the
so Church of Ireland.
Agnes is our school who's giving the talk this evening. The office that she has would have been the time.
Would have been a nice office.
Yes. How you doing? How you doing?
I was just saying, it's very hard to come to today. You really want to go out and enjoy
I know.
it.
That's the thing. Poor Agnes. She's
If you want to go to something, you go to Ireland.
yeah. That's the thing. So, well, look, I've left the blinds open a little bit for you, so you get a little bit of the sunshine coming through.
If you told them which she is.
Well, I'll be knocking the lights down.
There's a
That's
slide.
okay.
You're going to slides, is there?
Sorry?
There's a slide.
Oh yeah. This is her slide, so she'll be going. So I'll knock it down.
I have to.
Oh, you have to.
The short version and long version.
Well, this is being recorded. Actually, I'm being recorded as we speak. We're recording this for a podcast later, so it can be edited and then made available online. So, well, I should leave you for a moment.
You're going to have to drink, yeah, I'll have to. And two chances, all right.
If I had it in the deli here,
I have two chances.
That's it. Once you've introduced her, just press this, theatre lights, hit low, and then press to put on full screen. Okay. So, just hit low. And then, okay. Then goes ready for the presentation. Actually, you could probably leave them on for the intro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. That's grand.
Okay.
It's just it's better for the, and that's
We're meeting Chrissy next week.
the No, it'll be 2 weeks' time.
2 weeks.
Yeah, well, I just want to confirm with her. It's just Audrey hadn't come back to me. So now that she said the 19th is okay, I'll set it up with Chrissy.
And report as well.
Well, I put him in that email. He hasn't responded yet, but
Well, we could try our own meeting with that, because really what
Yeah.
we have to go through is what we have on the dates.
Yes.
You know? Because I think to take on the more projects, we'd really wait till September and see,
yes.
are we going to just run this?
Well,
or
we
do
do
something?
kind of wrap up. This
Yeah.
is what we've done. You're happy enough with those questions?
Yeah, that's grand.
I'll set that up and I'll send it to everyone who's attending.
Yeah.
And Bernie up there, Bernie's attending every single lecture. I think she should get a promise for the rest of attending.
No, it'd be interesting.
Yeah. So I'll
And
send it.
particularly with the time change.
Yeah. We just want to save lives.
Well, we have to do that.
Yeah, well, the only thing is I don't have
Ready to rock and roll. I said I'm ready to rock and roll.
Do you want to wait a few minutes or
Yeah.
start? So other people could be on their way from work,
Yeah.
so you wouldn't know. It's up to you now if you want to start or wait.
In respect to the people who are here, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay.
Wait, which button?
Hold on now, I'll introduce it before you start messing with any buttons.
All right.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you here to the School of Nursing and Midwifery. My name is Carol King and I head up the Civic Engagement project, which one of our projects has been 7 lectures starting from last September, and this is the final one today. And the idea of the civic engagement lectures are really to spread research and special experience and share it with members of college and the general public. In terms of safety, if the alarm bell should go off for a fire, there's an exit at the back up there, but since there's so few of us, I would recommend we all head down here, at least you know where you're going, which is down to the front hall. If I could ask you to turn your phones to mute, please, during the talk. And just to say that this lecture will be podcast and go on the school's website. If you ask a question or anything at the end, your question will be just typed. They won't see your voice or your face. It's just Agnes's presentation will be podcast. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Audrey Adams and Jenny Ryan, who with me are on the committee, for running this series. I'd like to introduce Agnes, who's just done a runner. Oh, there she is, yeah. And Agnes is our head of school, so I have to be very careful what I say about her. And she's going to talk to us about a study called The Insight of Visible Lives, of which she was the lead on this study, and she's going to share some of the findings with us. Agnes's history is nursing and education in the field of mental health. As I said, she's head of the school here as well, and she is, I think, a person who really is suitable for this type of research because she does understand how people feel, and she's very open and she's very caring. And I would imagine that's what you're going to be talking about anyway. So I think you probably are a great person to have done this. We will have a question and answer session at the end if you want to ask Agnes any question. So if I could ask you just to give Agnes a warm welcome, please.
Good evening. It's nice to see some faces, familiar faces, and to see some new faces that I haven't met before or seen. I just want to say you're very, very welcome. And I'm sure it was a hard contest because it's absolutely gorgeous out there. So to have to decide to be here for 3/4 of an hour or instead of the sunshine, I hope it pays off. Okay. As Carol said, I was the lead researcher on this study in terms of visible lives, which was a research study that was commissioned and funded by GLEN, which was the Gay Lesbian Equality Network here in Ireland. And I suppose I would like to dedicate maybe this talk to Christopher Robson, who died in March. And he was the civil rights activist here in Ireland, co-founder of GLEN, and was part of the board at GLEN, and was part of the steering group that was involved in this research study. And a nicer, more warm, affirmative gentleman you couldn't have met. And so I learned a lot from him along the way. So I suppose I'm going to talk maybe for 40 minutes. When I start, it's very hard to shut me up on this topic. So I hope that, and I will give you a flavour of some of the journey we had through this piece of work. I suppose the aims of the study, or what we were asked to do, was to look at, I suppose, the needs and experiences of older LGBT people in Ireland, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people. And when we say over 55 is older, it sounds very young, but that was the brief we were given, to look from an over 55, people who are currently living in the Republic of Ireland and who were identified as being attracted to people of the same sex or had an identity as LGBT. And to look at some issues around policies or recommendations for policy, practice and future research. I'm just going to move this so I can. Make it easy. Okay. So to set it, I suppose, in context, and I suppose having good statistics on the number of people that are identify as lesbian, gay or bisexual over 55 in Ireland, this is what it's estimated as. Again, in terms of the transgender community, we wouldn't have a huge amount of statistics that you could say are good statistics, because our central, in terms of the CSO, and that has only started to put it or include it within their data collection. From this age group, I suppose what you would say, especially when I look down here and see all these young people, as you get older, let me tell you, you get more invisible in society. So I think that, and if you happen to identify as a lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender, I think, you're a doubly invisible group. That you're invisible in the context of your age, but also in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I suppose the research in this area is, within the Irish context, and I think internationally as well, from looking at it, is quite sparse. That we have some studies would say that but it's very much focused on the younger population, like Paula Mayock's work, and other studies in. Come in, you're welcome. So within this population, I suppose for us it was a very specific age group that we were looking at. When we designed the study, we were looking at it and considering in terms of how we were going to access this population and this group, because by very nature, in terms of that age group, that they have been grown up in a very different context to being Irish society today. So, in fact, that there may be quite a hidden population. That there were going to be issues in terms of trying to locate people who maybe have not come out or have come out to a small group of people. That they were not going to be, if they were in relationships, they may not be active on the gay scene. And by the very nature, I suppose, when we went out there and spoke to people, you will see that it was the age profile. They talked a lot about, I suppose, the youth orientation of the gay community, so in terms of how we were going to access them and still give this group of men and women confidence that their confidentiality and that would be still maintained. So we designed, I suppose, a survey which we did online for postal, and they could also have it as telephone, and then we did some follow-up interviews. Our criteria, as I said, they had to be over 55, living in the Republic of Ireland, and I self-identify as attracted to the same sex or identify as an LGBT person. And we got ethical approval from Trinity. I suppose you could do a whole lecture on recruitment and the lessons we learned in terms of recruiting for the sample in this group. And I keep saying, you know, a lot of things are written in the books around research and recruitment. In a lot of cases, it's about good shoe leather, and it's about getting out there, and it's about, in some ways, thinking about ways of creatively getting people. So from looking at what newspapers people would be reading in rural communities, where would people be going in rural communities, so that we didn't end up with a sample that came purely from the cities. So where we ended up in the end, I suppose, was we had a survey with 144 people who had completed the survey with their mean age was around 60, even though we had them right across up into the 70s. And the interviews, we did 36 interviews. Again, the mean age is around the 60 mark. And again, the ratios were, in terms of the way people were in the numbers, was kind of, we had kind of, for every 6 gay men that were in it, we had kind of 3 women that identified as lesbian and 1 that identified as bisexual, or in the other way in terms of the transgender. So our transgender group was a much smaller group. So I suppose some of the stuff that we heard, and I suppose I would say what the study is about to say at the very beginning, like there is no normative way of describing or saying that this group are a homogeneous group in any way. And I suppose what you found and heard in the interviews and through the surveys and what people wrote in the qualitative comments in the surveys was very much around a very rich, complex tapestry that encompassed people's lives. And I'm just going to try and give you some flavour of some of the issues that emerged, and I suppose some of the challenges that it raises for us, for me as well, in terms of working in healthcare and educating in a healthcare context in relation to this population. I suppose one of the things that we have to remember that this population would have grown up in an era where their sexual orientation would have been pathologised, that for the younger group here, in terms of realising that homosexuality would have been included within the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Illness and only came out of it, you know, when I started working in healthcare in the late 70s, like it was still in DSM as a mental health illness. So that they not only have grown up in an environment where it was pathologised, they would have grown up in an environment where it was equally criminalised, and where the discourse within Irish society would have been very strong in terms of creating a sense that they were deviant and other. So what people talked about, especially in the interviews, was growing up in that sense of when they started to get a sense that they were in some way different, that it was this type of environment of them trying to learn survival skills from a very early age. And as this 70-year-old man said, he said, the environment in which I grew up, admitting orientation would have been untenable. I was born 70 years ago, and that means that acknowledging my orientation wasn't even a possibility. People will say, of course it was, and so on, but not from me. In the family and in the circumstances in which I was born, it would have meant that I would have been ostracised. I would have been beheaded because there was no understanding. And this man, in fact, had never come out to anybody. I mean, in terms of, he had come to be involved in the study. Part, I think, was about telling one other human being at this stage of his life, knowing that there was going to be a real sense that he wouldn't be identified. So I suppose I think it's that understanding that this is the context that people grew up. And again, in terms of how that learning of survival skills, like this is another quote from he said, 2 lads from my class came down the street. They started shouting up at the window, queer, queer. I was in the room paralysed. It made me conscious from a very early age that I was not part of the pack. I was different. I addressed it by removing myself from mainstream like sport. I became a loner and hid in the academic side of things. I identified very skillfully those people who potentially were going to be dangerous. So I learned those skills from a very early age. So there was a real sense of listening to people describing, trying to learn survival skills, trying to read situations where they might give themselves away because of the consequences of it. So some of the survival skills, and because there's lots in the study, but some of the survival skills people spoke about was learning skills of what I would call very selective disclosure. Who was safe to tell? Developing what they themselves called secretive or divided lives, where they had a particular life, maybe if they came to the city, but it was a very, very different life when they went back home. And I suppose in some ways trying to think of the consequences of that on people's sense of self and sense of mental health as well. I think the other issue that in terms of the group that we interviewed and the surveys, 26% of the survey, people that have been involved in the survey, and 30% of people who have been involved in the interviews had married. And again, that was very much about, some level of it was about a survival skill. Some level of it was also, if you understand in this context and in that era, people were speaking the language that sexual orientation was nearly a lifestyle choice, and that you could go engage in therapy to change your sexual orientation. So there was part of that in people spoke about, that they really believed that, if I had a relationship with a woman, or if I was a lesbian woman, I had a relationship with a man, that in some ways I would shift some of my sexual orientation. And I suppose for a lot of this population that we had interviewed, a high number of them had left Ireland and were now back. So that immigration was a major coping strategy, because it allowed people to be themselves. They allowed them to maybe to come out in a much safer environment. So I suppose when you look at then, in terms of one of the questions we had asked was, what were the kind of the mean age of awareness that this group of people, in terms of when they started to have a sense of identifying in any way as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. I mean, the mean age of awareness for the survey group was about 20. Now, if you look at it in the context of Mayock's study, which is a much more recent study and looks at it in younger LGBT people, the mean age in that population in Ireland today is 14 of awareness. The mean age for this population of coming out was 31. The mean age in Mayock's study is 21. So we do see that, we'll say, things have changed over time. So in the mean age for this group in terms of socialising with somebody that knew that they, of their LGBT identity, was 33. So if you think about it in the context of formative years, the people were going through their adolescence and into their early adulthood without ever disclosing sexual orientation, or without ever feeling that they were socialising with other LGBT people. And I think that in itself had a certain amount of consequences for people. I think the other issue that we heard a lot about was the impact, I suppose, for this group of imagery around LGBT, you know, that this population was growing up in where if they turned on the television, the only thing they saw was either very camp men or kind of very butch women. That was kind of the way it was portrayed. So in terms of having something to identify with, it wasn't coming from the media either. In terms of, I suppose, that when they did decide to disclose for this population, it had quite varying consequences for a lot of people when they disclosed within the family context. I mean, it didn't mean the loss of parents and the loss of brothers and sisters for this group. Now, some of them had connected back in with family, but a lot of them had lost connection with the family. I suppose for the people who had married, the struggle, if they, we'll say in terms of the population that we interviewed had married, there was only one person that we had interviewed that was out but still in the relationship. You know, they weren't in a sexual relationship, but they were still together. In the context of all of the other people, their relationship with their partner had dissolved, and had dissolved sometimes in quite acrimonious terms. And I suppose the struggle for people that had married and had children to come out was just so difficult and I suppose when you asked, you know, what was it? Because you kind of think psychologically it maybe would have been, you say, easier to stay. And for a lot of these people, that the thing was about survival, because they had had significant mental health crisis and mental health issues. And it was purely in terms of knowing that for my mental health status and my mental health survival, I need to come out. I think that the struggle for them to tell their children, and the worry about disclosing to their children, and the worry about the impact that was going to have on their children's lives. Now, there were some really lovely stories as well about the understanding of children in terms of the context of people's lives. So while I suppose 75% of the people that we interviewed or did the survey on reported that their mental health was very, very good, I think what this group had 32% of them had experienced some form of mental health problem in their lives, which is a high number. 11% had seriously thought about ending their life, and 5% had self-harmed in the past year. And I think that's significant, while it may sound a small number. And we are hearing every day about people taking their own lives and self-harming behaviour. We're hearing it in the context of the younger population. When you take this and you look at it in the older population, remembering this is over 55, and you look at other studies like Morgan's study and that has looked at issues around self-harming in the older population, you find that this is much higher, because you're talking about in Morgan's study, we'll say between the ages 45 and 63 it was 0.3%, and over 65 it was 0.1%. So in terms of this group, they are a group that are particularly vulnerable in that context, or at least a percentage of people. And there was a high percentage of people worrying about their drinking. And for many in the early part of their lives, drinking was a way of coping. And 11% was still taking medication for a mental health issue. And I suppose if we want to theorise about it in that context, we can theorise it in the context of the impact of minority stress. That it's not so much about the identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. It's about what happens in terms of society's attitudes to me. So from a personal experience point of view, again, this was a group of people that were exposed to the same levels of violence and aggression as mainstream, if you want to call it, society and that, but there was a much higher incidence in terms of 48% had experienced different forms of verbally insulting, 20% had been punched or kicked, 25% had been threatened with physical violence, and for 20% had been threatened to be outed, which in that context must be a very, very difficult place to be. 16% had experienced some form of domestic violence, and 7% had experienced sexual violence. And I suppose just in terms of commenting on their experience of sexual violence, their willingness to report was an issue. Again, especially in terms of for if it was in the context of a same-sex relationship, they felt that if they went and reported, they mightn't get a hearing, or their shame and the stigma stopped them reporting. And especially in terms of, I think the area that really was highlighted in the interviews was the transgender community, because of if they went to report, they just didn't feel that it was going to be understood. And there was one situation where a transgender woman in one of the interviews had been quite badly assaulted and had gone and reported it, but then decided that she wouldn't pursue it because she felt that if it came to court, that her gender identity would be an issue. So I think that these are some of the issues we need to think of. I suppose just to comment on terms of this was also a group, and that's a group of people that have lived their lives with absolute multiple losses. And I think that was the other thing that was quite striking in the interviews, that not alone have we'd say they lost in terms of their coming out, and in some cases were losing, we'd say if they were married, they were losing the relationship with their partner, or their maybe some of their children, but also they had in terms of the intergenerational support, in terms of growing older and having grandchildren. And the access to them. But this was also a group of people, if you think in terms of the age profile, that had lived through the AIDS crisis. So had experienced, the loss of significant friends, and not just maybe one or two friends, but had experienced that. And I suppose the other losses, that was a number of people had experienced, about 8% or 9% of people had experienced a loss of a same-sex partner. And I think that what was striking was that whole area of disenfranchised grief, where their loss was not acknowledged by society, by the wider community. And I suppose this is just a quote from a lesbian woman. She said, "It was never really mentioned after I split up with her. And when she died, nobody ever mentioned it. Again, because it was another woman. It wasn't the same as the relationship with the opposite sex, if you see what I mean. It was irrelevant. She was in my life for 28 years, and they all knew her. She was at most of the family weddings. The family all knew her. It was bizarre, never mentioned. When you actually stop and think about it, by not acknowledging her, it was not acknowledging me." And, there was... In that situation, the family was aware of it. We interviewed a particular somebody as well that had married and had left the marriage relationship and had been in another relationship with a same-sex relationship, and her partner had died. But because she hadn't come out, there was nobody. Because most people thought that who came to visit was just a good friend of hers that would come from England every now and then. So that whole sense of being consumed by the loss and grief but not being able to speak it. I suppose we were, I suppose other areas that we were interested in is in terms of, from an ageing point of view, and I think one of the big issues that was for some people, not for them all, was the loneliness was a significant issue because of, I suppose, the absence of some forms of traditional support. If you think that 43% of this population was single and 46% were living alone, which is much higher again than the general population. And I suppose as one of the things that they spoke about a lot to us was about the difficulty of locating kind of suitable LGBT activities. That the gay community is very youth orientated, and as people get older, in terms of how do they access it, and the challenges, I suppose, of accessing it if people moved out of city life into rural communities, in terms of the cost of getting back into city life, but equally the lack of resources out there. I suppose what you didn't think about is, you think in today's world there's a much greater integration of lesbian gay men into mainstream, if you want to put it that way, and even though I don't like calling it that sense, but pubs and that culture, where this population would have grown up in an era where you would have particular pubs that would have been identified as gay spaces. And they spoke a lot about some of those being closing down. You know, which is a good thing for, in terms of, you say, well, there's a much greater acceptance and an integration, but for people who have been going there and using those venues, it leaves quite a gap in terms of the lack, I suppose, of those type of social spaces. And again, there was a high percentage that didn't feel part either for the local community or the LGBT community. And they talked a lot about, I suppose, in terms of, and our message back to Glenn at the time was in terms of their whole issue of where is the imagery of older LGBT people, that a lot of what we see is youth focused. I put this up in terms of 50% reported no religion, not that I'm making a value judgment on it, but I can well understand that because their narrative around their interaction with mainstream church and with religion was quite negative, and I don't need to explain to you why. But I think what we need to think about in this context is that as people age, and you know, in terms of when the surveys of the general population says about 2%, I think, report have not been engaged in some form of that the church in some cases is a social outlet for people. It is a form of community engagement. And I suppose in terms of the church for this group of people, their experiences had been negative. That's not to say that they hadn't redefined spirituality and found some people had found spiritual spaces and spiritual connections by redefining and rethinking things and challenging some of the core messages they had got in their younger life. So I suppose for some people it was about that fear of growing old and being on your own. You know, the fear basically is the same. What about the future? What am I going to do? Who's going to take care of me? Families are gone. And what do you do? And who do you go to for help? I'm aware that I'm on my own, and where do I get support? Because I'm away from home and family. I don't have any family around, and friends are few and far between. And I suppose this was somebody now that had moved back from abroad and had not great connection with the family. For those of us who come out late in life, it tends to be much lonelier since we are not growing older with a partner. I suppose they are like the main thing for them was that they wanted to live in their own home, and were quite concerned about losing their independence and being a burden. But that concern was very caught into their concern about, I suppose, the heteronormative culture within healthcare. And I think this is the message for us in terms of working in healthcare, and of the older age services, that they are strongly dominated by a heteronormative think. So they were really concerned about their sense of if they were out, if they ended up going to old age services, how would they be accepted? Not just how would they be accepted by the people who ran the services, but how would they be accepted by their peers that were there, you know, in terms of if they had come out in that context. They were really concerned about being not recognised or respected as for their LGBT identity. And again, this was a big issue for people from the transgender group. You know, and I think that that is a challenge for us in services and in healthcare. And I suppose, again, that whether their partners would be respected in their decision making. And this is just a quote from: "The day that a lesbian or gay or bisexual is in the closet and goes into one of these homes, it is a first step, because they will never be able to talk about it again if they haven't had the confidence to talk about it during their life. Defining oneself as gay or lesbian people within a county home or whatever would be just impossible. Some part of their lives will be shut down, and I find that really dreadful." And I think that that was a sentiment of what the fear was about. While we think that things maybe have changed in Irish society, I think that, and I know that the international study was published, and there, as of last week, and that in terms of the statistics there still around the experience of discrimination. For this group, the fear and anxiety still exists. About 34% was feared that they would be harassed if they had feared losing their friends if they came out and told. Their issue of holding hands in public, or in terms of being visibly display of affection, 40% felt that they would be unsafe, and 36% said they just wouldn't do it. And showing any form of affection, again, in terms of there was a high incidence of, you know, just fear of what the consequences was going to be, even though we think that we have moved on. I think in terms of what's, from a healthcare point of view, 22% of them said that they would not reveal their identity to healthcare practitioners because of fear of negative reactions. And 40% felt respected as an LGBT, 43% felt respected, but then what happens to the other 57%? And felt that one of the issues was that they felt that healthcare practitioners didn't have sufficient knowledge to respond in sensitive ways. So that's, I suppose, in terms of the negative side. I suppose I just want to talk a little bit in terms of the one thing I think that struck us in this study was the level of resilience and courage and strength of this group of people. And it was palpable if you interviewed them, no matter how distressing that the story was, and that there was a sense that they had lots to teach us about their strength of spirit, their ability to integrate, their ability to forgive, their ability to move on, their ability to celebrate for what the younger generation of today have and not feel that they missed out. And I think that was very strong in terms of, so 79% of them felt that their quality of life was good or very good. And they had come to a point, and I just love some of these quotes. They said, "I'm very, very comfortable. I'm totally happy. I don't actually give a bugger about what the people think of me. I actually couldn't care at this stage. If they don't like it, they can lump it." And I think some of this came with the wisdom of age. You know, I'm getting to the point where I think I just don't care. Grow up, get on with it. Do you know? There's so much happening out there. What does it matter? And my life is mine. It's just mine. So I think in terms of when you look at some of the things in terms of their development of resilience, what you see is that they had developed, I suppose, certain individual and group processes and strategies to help them to build their resilience and their strength of spirit. And it wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something that happened over quite a significant period of time. And the convergence of lots of different things into people's lives at that time. So I suppose some of the ways is around the multiple pathways and things that people talk to us about, was, I suppose, first getting to a point where they made a decision to accept their LGBT identity, even if they hadn't come out, and recognising that that was a core to their personhood. And part of that was about re-scripting some of the scripts that they had got as they grew up, in some ways that it was a lifestyle choice, that it was some way deviant, that it was some way sinful. So a lot of that script had to be redone, and some of the parts that people had talked about was been learning to let go of the negative feelings and the resentment and the frustration that they had felt because of some of the messages they had been given at different times in their lives. And I think one of the things that was really strong was people's involvement in education, in terms of people who had gone back to school and had taken programs either in philosophy or theology, or that had helped them to get a different theoretical perspective, a perspective again on how to challenge some of the discourse that they had been exposed to, and getting a greater sense of self-awareness for themselves. As I said, moving abroad was things that for some people, and connecting in, I think, with peers and professional support networks. That's like 10% of them or more people had accessed professional counselling at different stages in their lives to get through the times. Hanging around, as they said, with accepting and affirmative family and friends. And if for some people it was about making reconnections with family, that was quite a significant thing. Or, their family member, in terms of one of the women who was transgender woman, and she spoke about her mother when she was dying, saying to her brothers, leave, can you leave? I'd like to speak to my daughter. And she said the fact that she used the word daughter was, just such an important thing for her in terms of acceptance and being able to move on with in her own life. Maintaining contact with LGBT friends, and that was, I think, a very significant thing for people who had come back from abroad, because when they come back in middle age, integrating and trying to connect into and to find LGBT friends here in Ireland was much more challenging. So it was about trying to keep contact there, and as saying, because keeping busy and some community involvement, and for some people they talked about, having a positive sense of humour and outlook. For those people, I suppose, that were involved from a political activist point of view, that was in terms of, for some people it was going back to education, for that they got a new script. For others it was the political activism that gave them the new script. So I suppose I'm just conscious of the time in terms of, so some of the challenges I think that we could summarise in terms of and think about is that this group of people are a doubly invisible in society. Their supports may be limited because of in terms of there's a large number of non-partnered. Their traditional family supports may not exist because of I suppose, of life losing contact in terms of if they had come out early in their lives or come out later in their lives if they were in marriage relationships. Again, I think there is a high level of fear of discrimination in health and social care services. And you might say, well, that's just a perceptual issue. We're wonderful in health and social care services. But perception is important, because that's if people feel that they can't access, they can't disclose, that they, then in terms of this population, as they age in need of health care, will be less, reminds the word I'm looking for, they may be reluctant to come to services. That I think there's anxiety around long-term residential care, and I think some of this is well-founded. If you go back into some of our long-term residential care facilities and even look at the brochures, they are very written in the context of heterosexual I suppose they have limited community involvement and participation in terms of, and their critique, I suppose, of the lack of services for older LGBT people, their fear of violence and discrimination, and I suppose that the other issue is that came up, and I'm not going to talk about much here, was this general perception that LGBT people are wealthy. That they call it the pink pound, and I think that in itself has had a particular impact, whereas they are struggling the same as everybody else. I suppose what you do see from a positive point of view is the really well-developed positive coping strategies, their ability to enter older age with an acceptance of diversity that is, would humble a lot of us. Their creation, I suppose, of families of choice in terms of, and their flexibility in gender roles. I think for me, I suppose my passion around it is the fact that this is a generation that fought for the rights of our younger generation. And I do feel that as people age into healthcare services, that we really need to challenge so that they are not discriminated within the older age services again, and that they don't have to fight to shift that we start to look at the services. And I just want to leave the final words, I suppose, to two of the participants. They said, "We survived, we are warriors and faced many of ours and others' challenges. And we are the generation who are given meaning to being older LGBT. So there is a challenge, adventure, a degree of excitement and surprise and tremendous freedom." So I just want to acknowledge, I suppose, Glenn, the HSE and Age and Opportunity who funded the work, and more importantly, thank the participants that were just made research one of the most enjoyable, while it was just in terms of distressing, but in terms of the people that we met when we were out doing this work. It was just absolutely a pleasure to meet people and to be challenged by them and to be challenged my own thinking. And this is just in terms of the research team. And the study itself, the full study, is up on the Glen website. So thank you.
I'd like to thank Agnes for that really fascinating presentation. And Jenny has a microphone if anyone would like to ask Agnes a question. Somebody brave to start?
No? Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yes, Agnes, thank you very much. It was wonderful and illuminating and also very moving. And I suppose my personal interest in this has been for several decades, the gender differences that may or may not exist. From my own reading, I certainly came with an expectation that perhaps it might have been easier for older women as lesbians to come out than perhaps their male equivalent. But what I've been finding in the work I've been doing is that that's not necessarily the case, and the percentages and numbers do not support that. I just wondered if you got any insights as to why that was the case.
Well, I think in terms of, I theorise myself on some of it in terms of, one, I think it's easier for women to have a relationship and it not to be questioned, so I don't need to come out, in the sense of, so people will explain it away, so I'm just thinking about the woman that I had interviewed and that her partner had died a few months earlier. People in the community had explained that away as her friend. And yet, so I think we are socialised in so many ways that we don't even question that. And even some of the women here talked about that did have partners, so even when they were in hospital, people automatically assumed they were their sister or they were. So I think that's one of the reasons. And I think that in terms of it's no different, because people have grown up thinking that there was something, deviance, the impact of the church on it. So I'm even say to myself, why did I even think that it would have been easier for women? I don't know whether that's answers. Do you have, what's your thinking on it?
No, but one of the things that struck me is that coming out is still difficult. If you have a job in, for instance, a church-run hospital or a church-run school, whether you're a man or a woman, and that there is still, it's not just a stigma.
That means you can, And I mean, some of the people in this study spoke about that. The real worry that they were going to lose their jobs. And you see, in some ways, we might think that that's past tense, but it's not. And we see from the research in schools and that concern is and in some cases it's real. That it's.
Well, thank you very much. It was a really interesting speech. I just wanted to ask, Could you elaborate maybe on the type of services that are available for LGBT holders? I know that you spoke about like the fact that the LGBT community, and specifically the gay male community, it's a community that it's quite orientated towards youth, and I think sometimes in advocacy as well, there is an emphasis on youth advocacy. So obviously belong to does amazing work, and it's kind of a pattern I think that sort of globally sort of. You put emphasis on advocacy for youth. So, for example, in the States, like the Trevor Project does really good stuff, but Sage does as well, and doesn't get the type of depth. So, if you could, what type of services are available to?
And I think the services, and some people here would maybe be able to answer them better than me. But in terms of some of the services that are for older people are starting to develop, like we have, what is it? A mock. It's a kind of an out, kind of an about kind of group that women go in terms of and go walking and that. Then we have Outhouse has and down in Capel Street they have started up kind of a service for older people, and the one, and why is it not? And I thought it was a really creative name. Owls, older lesbian women. I thought that's a really good, wise. So some of the services are starting up, and again it's about, I suppose, in terms of this generation, we're very much hidden. So it is about advocacy, but it's also about the younger community advocating for older services. That I don't know whether there's anybody else here that maybe can comment. So what you are seeing is that there is pockets of it, and there are people within the older gay and lesbian community are starting to get out there and develop the services. But it's a struggle, and they will tell you that. It's a struggle, and it's a struggle within rural communities. Because again, you're talking about people's concern within kind of local communities, because some of the people we would have interviewed would have come to Dublin, to find a space because they didn't want to be out in their and of course then as you're getting older, travelling, may I tell you, it gets harder. That there's old age brings certain limitations to your ability to access, but it's also expensive in terms of if you're not in the 65, 66 with your free pass yet. Okay.
My name is Edmund Lynch. I'm one of the founder members of the gay movement, which was founded in Trinity back in 1973. And then when we succeeded in having our first meeting in 74, general public, I convinced Gay Byrne, because at that time I was working in RT, to pay for Rose Robertson to come over from England and have her on the show. But he gave me his number, which I still have. That if she wasn't any good, he'd drop her, but he still would pay. Now, it's rather interesting just listen to the way you deliver the paper. I'm one of the people that, when we went out to found the gay movement, that told my parents I was gay, because I couldn't tell people to be themselves if I hadn't got the courage. I wasn't thrown out of the house. In fact, I inherited the house, and I still live in it in Drimna, so I never had to go away. But then I'm a cheeky bastard, I mean, I'm not afraid. If someone's going to hit me, I make sure to be able to step out of the way, been sensible about it. And it's great to see people changing. But at the moment, I've decided to, I've always made programs, which Corporation of RT, it's their money, on gay subjects. I was lucky enough that I was able to talk to people in the beginning. Who made decisions, and they got the power, and they looked after me in that sense. But at the moment, I'm interviewing older people who could talk about what it was like in the early days. And I must say that people are willing to talk. I'm surprised, and I'm shooting them all on camera in front of Chroma Key, but with a proviso that if they don't want it to be
Yeah.
seen in a programme.
Yeah.
Don't want to be seen here, but it'll go to an archive. I had considered the Queer Archive to get it. I changed my mind, because that all now goes to the National Library. And as they're so inefficient in the National Library, I want all the material to be available to anyone, no matter where they are in the country. You can't get that. So I have to look at either Trinity, UCD, or somewhere else. And I'm still always looking for people to talk. I'll meet them for coffee or tea, whatever they want. I pay for it, but that's as far as it goes. But I'm doing the whole thing without a budget.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have the resources at all.
Yeah.
I'm lucky enough that I've been able to hire the top cameraman, because he was a colleague of mine in RT I used to work with, but I'm paying him. But normally you would pay about 600 euros a day, but I don't pay that, you know. I pay him out of my pension. But I'm just saying that it is great that there are surveys like this. I feel sorry for a lot of people, because I think it's up to every individual to have the strength to be themselves. Because I think every young person's mother always knows their own child. And once you win her over, your father will come in quietly and might talk for a month, but after that it becomes one of your best friends. And then the other way is your nieces and nephews. They're great. And they'll do everything, you know, for you, you know. But all I'm saying is we need more surveys. And I don't think it makes any difference whether you're a person in the city or in the country. If you're lonely, you're lonely. But the way to get out of loneliness is, I suppose, to talk to someone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, sorry. I'd just like to endorse that point about having more surveys. I found this lecture quite interesting, particularly, you know, the statistics that you presented. My own experience, I was in the Irish Army and the Defence Forces from the age of 20 to the age of 41, and when I left to go to college as a mature student, and I didn't come out to anyone until I was actually in Trinity. In my early 40s, and because the environment there facilitated it, and particularly having a tutor like David Norris certainly did. And but it's that experience of living for 21 years in denial for fear of, because in those days in the army, there was no court martial. You were simply discharged. Service is no longer required. And if you wanted to appeal that, you had to go through the ignominy of bringing the state to court. And that was the method they used. And you know, so I certainly like more. I think more work should be done in these areas, and institutions like that looked at. It's the just. I'll finish on one note. There's a tendency, I'm sure some people can relate to it, to sort of laugh at yourself and join in the laughter and hope that you be concealed that way. But I remember the first time I went overseas with the UN, was working alongside the British Army in Cyprus, and the Brits had a joke: what's the difference between a gay soldier and a straight soldier? And their answer was a six-pack. So I'll just leave it at that.
And like when you think in terms of, you know, like I suppose I work in healthcare, and my background is in the area of mental health. So I suppose that would be where my passion in terms of that we need to consider that, you know, that a lot of this oppression, and that was the seeds of significant mental health issues. You know, and that when people are coming into mental health services, we need to be conscious that, you know, take off that heterosexual head, and it's not so much the gay issue, but it's the issue of the way people have been treated. You know, because I think that, you know, if there's a danger of, you say, well, you know, there's a high incidence of mental health issues among the gay lesbian community, that some way we say that there is a genetic vulnerability or something, and it's about the social discrimination that people have experienced, and are coming into old age services with having lived through that. and now coming into old age services, still being fearful that they are going to be exposed to it. And you can be sure they will be exposed to it unless, and I think a big challenge for us as healthcare practitioners is that if they're not exposed to it by healthcare practitioners, they may be exposed to it by the residents within the services, because they have grown up with the same kind of discourse. And if we haven't shifted that, and how do we challenge that if we are working within those services? So I suppose that's where my kind of agenda is coming from. Yeah. She's good.
Just work? Yeah. I just wanted to ask my colleagues, myself, social work wannabes just graduating. I'm really glad that we came. This is the type of information that we need to go out and have in our bag and in our head. But where do you take it to make sure that people like us that are graduating need different glasses or different lenses in our glasses?
Yes.
Where do you put that, or where do you see your work going next?
Okay, where do I see my work going next? I suppose some of the area that I'd be doing some work with in terms of education is with people working in the whole area of nursing homes and residential care. That is, I suppose, where there's one piece is publishing it in the peer-reviewed journals, the other piece is speaking to the practitioners who don't maybe read the peer-reviewed journals or because they're busy with hands-on work and engagement. So I think that's part of it. And then it's also in terms of looking at issues and how it's integrated, stuff is integrated within our own curricula here, within our mental health curriculums, within our so in terms of a lot of, we'd say, even at this stage, this would be integrated into, in terms of my own teaching, in terms of when I teach on the Masters in Gerontology or dementia or so any of the old age stuff that I would teach on, I mean, I would be using a lot of the research in that context. But then it's getting it out into frontline practitioners, the people that are out there already. So, thank you.
I'll probably regret asking this question after, but anyway, I'm just talking out, and it's not meant to be in the slightest bit negative, and I wouldn't be here attending this lecture if that was my stance. But about 25 years ago, I had something to do with a student, and actually he came to me and asked if he might have himself assessed, etc. Yeah. So I thought this was very mature of him and great insight into himself, that he understood this need in himself. So off he went. And he gave me the report. He didn't have to, but he voluntarily gave it to me. And it spoke there about him having gender identification problems and all the rest. And to tell you the truth, I didn't know what to do about that or anything else. And but anyway, as it turned out, as the years went by, it turned out that he had a propensity for sexual abuse of children. And and since then, as a relatively young man, he died. Now, I don't think it was suicide, but anyway, he had a certain disability, and he died. Now, I often said to myself, was that early indication, was that a signal I missed, that I could have helped him more in that area? And I don't know if, when I listened to you this evening, the restrictions on people in this situation, do they tend to act out more in that direction than others? You can see how it's not meant to be a loaded question or anything like that. It's just my experience, and it's an honest question in that area.
I don't think, in terms of, I haven't found any evidence that says, that there is a relationship between gender identity and child abuse in that case. We have plenty of evidence, say that if I have experienced child abuse in my life, that it will have impacts on it. But in terms of tying it to my sexual orientation, I think that what we need to make think about, and I think one of the things when you talk about people in terms of gender identity, like the services and what we really understand, and I think that one of the limitations in this study, and I think that, and this would be one of my messages to anybody funding studies, that we are putting gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender all together. They're a very different group of people that have very, very different needs, and we need to start disaggregating it and looking at the specific needs, and more of all the groups looking at the specific needs of the transgender community and getting a really good understanding and getting an understanding of it, because of course we have DSM coming out now, the newest DSM, and there's a big debate on how they're going to reconfigure transgender within that, and look at what services we have for people and how we get to an understanding and an explanatory model for that, beyond it being a mental illness, beyond that I have to go to get the psychiatrist so when you look at, I suppose, the people that we met in this, interviewed in this, the group I would say that we have such poor services for, and that we are so badly serving, is the transgendered community. But I think from your point of view, I think then there's the other issue of paedophilia and understanding that, but I think that is a very separate issue in my head until somebody shows me any other evidence than the transgender issue. Now that's not to say that, I'm a heterosexual woman. It doesn't say that I can't be sexually abused as well, or that somebody that is gay doesn't sexually abuse, or that. But I think it's the danger is that we conflate them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay,
So. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to thank you once again, Agnes, for a fascinating presentation.
I hope the sun is still shining out there and that you have a safe trip home. Thank you. How do I disconnect this?
Thank you. Well done.
I wanted to knock that off, and I just said no to this man.
Thanks. That's for you.
Sit next to him.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I need it as a backdrop.
Sorry?
I need it as a backdrop.
Oh, that's fine. Just don't mess with it. Yeah.
Sixth floor film.
And then recently got married. Well, he's connected with the person, and they actually did it.
Oh, there it is.
Can you email me that presentation so I can make
Absolutely, yeah.
I can make a picture